we have an educational definition that is a little bit different from the medical definition that Dr. Miller was talking about. And that's a very important concept as you move through the system and into the educational world. We are bound by a different definition. It sort of maps on top of the medical definition, but not completely. It's very, very similar. So do you understand? We've got the medical world here, and now you're moving into the educational world. And this is the definition we are required to use. So I'm just going to read it out loud for you. Autism is a developmental disability. That's the same, right? You've been hearing about that, correct? It significantly affects, and that's a significant word because it has to have a significant effect or they may not be eligible for services in public schools. Even though you might have a diagnosis of autism, we have to show the significant effect. Okay, so significantly affecting verbal and nonverbal communication. Now, I just want to briefly mention that it's easy to spot difficulties with verbal communication, but it's more difficult to spot difficulties with nonverbal communication. And by that, we mean body language and understanding intent of people. When you get to the point of advocating for your child, make sure you look carefully at their interpretation of nonverbal language. They may not be able to recognize the look. You know how teachers have the look? They have a look and it says, I've got a headache, don't mess with me today. Or, I've had enough clowning around, stop now. And the kids in the classroom can kind of see that look and they know it's time to settle down. That nonverbal communication becomes difficult for our children with autism. So that's how it plays out in a classroom. Does that make sense? Okay, so affecting verbal and nonverbal communication and social interaction. And I have to tell you, my latest thing now, I think string art, you know the strings that you have to, you put them, you make designs and then the other person, that's my newest thing. I'm going to see if that'll work with kids with autism because it causes them to interact with another person and they have to cooperate in order to make that. So maybe next year I'll have that figured out. I'm so excited about that. I'm just working on that now. Okay, the point being that the social interaction is key. In education, education means academic growth and social growth. Okay, put that in your heads. Academic growth, ABC, 2 + 2 is 4, and social growth, cooperating on the playground, negotiating with your peers, sharing interests. So it's important that you remember that when you get to education, because we're not just concerned about whether or not they can read, we're concerned about their social development, okay? So you need to be armed with that information. Generally evident before age 3, Dr. Miller talked about that adversely affects a student's educational performance. Huge sentence, adverse effect. If it doesn't adversely affect educational performance, they may not be eligible for services in schools. That's why I want you to remember that educational performance is both academic and social. Okay, you promise you're going to stick that in your heads and keep it there until you get to the system. It's easy for some kids to interact with adults because we repair situations. Does that make sense? You know, if a child is not interacting like appropriately or in a typical manner, then the adult fixes that. We change our style, but kids don't. They go, that's weird. I don't want to play with you. And so that's why sometimes they do better with adults than with kids. It's important that you know that the intent of the law is for parents to tell us what you know about your kids, because the spirit of the law is parents know best and they know their children best. So that's the spirit of it. And sometimes when you get in these big meetings and you don't know the system and you're seeing all these scores and you have these people and you're the only person, sometimes that can be overwhelming. And I recognize that and I know that. Just hang in there and just hang in there. So adverse effect, all right. Other characteristics often associated with autism are engagement in repetitive activities. Dr. Miller talked about that, right? That's my favorite part. And stereotyped movements, resistance to environmental change or change in daily routines. And I'm here to tell you that 99% of the behavior problems and the meltdowns that I see in schools are because we changed the routine. How dare us change your routine? Maybe it was a substitute bus driver, or maybe the bus with the number 59 broke down and now it's a different bus, and that's not the same. And maybe the child is thinking, oh, the new bus driver, does he know the way to school? He may not know how to get me there. He may not know, I need to slow down. He may not know how to get me home. And those are some of the fears that they have when there is change in the routine. What I find is you guys are so afraid of changing the routine because you might cause a meltdown that suddenly everything is the same and you'll do anything not to disrupt the child. But we need to teach the child how to react to a surprise or how to react to a change. So that's one of our goals, okay? Keep it consistent, but then give advance notice and advance information that there's going to be a change. Okay, so resistance to environmental change or change in daily routines, and unusual responses to sensory experiences. I didn't hear all of Dr. Miller's talks. Did she talk about sensory experiences? And so how, a child may be reacting to the flicker of a fluorescent light, but you may not even notice it, or the sound of my voice could be like a hammer on your ears, or too much visual on the walls of the classroom could be visual screaming, and the child is really trying to screen all of this stuff out. Okay, so that's something that we're trying to figure out in schools, is how we can recognize the child's responses to sensory experiences. And I'll tell you, when it comes to smell, don't mess with me, because I can smell things that most people can't. So I get really, really stressed. And the autism in me starts coming out when there's bad smells around me. Okay, so it just makes me appreciate some of the challenges that our kids with autism are dealing with all the time. Because it might be the floor wax on the floor, or perfume. Perfume's a killer for me. Two more pieces of the educational definition. One, I'm just going to read it and be boring. The definition of autism does not apply if the student's educational performance is adversely affected, primarily because the student has an emotional disturbance or an intellectual disability as defined in the Utah Special Education rules. Okay, so know that there's some consideration here. And number two, a student who manifests the characteristics of autism after age 3 could be identified as having autism if the team determines that the student meets the definition of autism under these rules. That's legal words, and aren't they boring? But you have them in your handout. You can consider them when you get to your eligibility meeting.